Some women are defined by what they show the world. Jacqueline Kennedy was defined by what she refused to show. She was the most photographed woman of the 20th century, and one of its most carefully constructed mysteries. The smiling First Lady in the pillbox hat. The stoic widow in black who refused to weep in front of the cameras. The controversial bride of a Greek shipping billionaire who shocked a nation that believed it owned her grief. Each image was real. Each image was also a performance. And behind every performance was a woman who understood from a very young age that the distance between what you show the world and what you actually know is not a weakness. It is a weapon. She was born into money and raised in instability. She married brilliance and lived alongside betrayal. She sat inches from her husband when an assassin's bullet ended everything, refused to change out of her blood-soaked dress so the world could see what had been done, and then, 6 days later, stood in a servant's room at 2 in the morning, ensuring that history would remember the Kennedy years as Camelot rather than what they actually were. She had accepted $100,000 from her father-in-law to stay in a marriage she had once been prepared to leave. She carried the secrets of that marriage for 30 years, without flinching publicly once. And in the final weeks of her life, dying of cancer in her Fifth Avenue apartment, she invited her closest friends and family members to come one at a time and watch her feed the letters into a fireplace, burning everything that might have told the real story. This is not the story of an icon. It is the story of a girl who learned early that powerful men are faithless, a woman who spent her adult life managing that knowledge with extraordinary precision, and a private person who controlled the narrative of the most mythologized marriage in American history more completely than anyone who ever spoke freely could have managed. She said famously, "I want to live my life, not record it." She meant it, and she made absolutely certain of it. Before we go any further, we would love to know where in the world you are watching this today. Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you are new here, please consider subscribing so you never miss one of these stories. Now, to understand the woman Jackie Kennedy became, you have to begin with the girl she was born as and the family that made her. Southampton, New York, July 28, 1929. Jacqueline Lee Bouvier came into the world in one of the most fashionable corners of the American East Coast, the daughter of a French Catholic stockbroker with a legendary smile and a weakness for other women, and an Irish Catholic mother with a sharp eye for social advancement and very little patience for failure. From the first days of her life, the family presented one face to the world and lived an entirely different one behind closed doors. Jackie understood this distinction before she had a word for it. It was her first and most durable education. Her father, John Vernon Bouvier III, was known to everyone in New York society as Black Jack, and the nickname captured him perfectly. He was handsome in a way that stopped conversations in restaurants. He wore his clothes with the easy authority of a man who had never doubted that rooms existed primarily for his benefit. He spoke French, held himself with the particular carriage of old money, regardless of how much of it was actually present at any given moment, and was constitutionally, almost philosophically, incapable of fidelity. He drank too much and spent too freely, and he cheated on Jackie's mother from the very earliest days of the marriage in ways that were known about and whispered about in their social circle long before the children were old enough to understand what whispers meant. Jackie adored him. She adored the French words he used and the way he looked at her when she was the thing he was focused on, and she adored the particular quality of his attention, which was, when it landed on you, the most warming thing imaginable. She also watched what his attention cost the woman who had built her life around it. She watched her mother's face during the silences between conversations. She watched the way her parents moved around each other in rooms. She was absorbing something that she would spend the rest of her life recognizing in other people, which is that the most charming men frequently cause the most damage, and that the women who love them most completely are the ones who pay the highest price for that choice. None of this was hidden from the children in any meaningful sense. Jackie understood the shape of her parents' marriage well before the official version collapsed. And when it did collapse, when Jackie was 10 years old in 1939, and her parents finally divorced, the rupture landed in a world where such things were genuinely unusual among Catholic families of their social standing. Divorce carried stigma. It carried the specific Catholic shame of a sacrament violated. Jackie became quieter in its aftermath, more interior. She had always been the most observant person in any room she occupied, and now she added to that observation a layer of privacy so deliberate it would eventually become structural. She kept her real thoughts to herself. She had learned that showing them cost too much. Her mother's second marriage in 1942 to Hugh Auchincloss, a lawyer from genuinely old money whose family fortune substantially exceeded anything the Bouvier had possessed, produced the outward appearance of restoration. Jackie and her younger sister Lee were moved between two grand properties, summers at Hammersmith Farm in Newport, Rhode Island, and school terms at Marywood near Washington. The estates were beautiful. The lifestyle was exactly what her mother had been striving toward. From the outside, it looked like elevation back to the tier where the family belonged. But Jackie was now a child of divorce in a world of intact Protestant families. She was a Catholic girl moving through the social circles of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. She was a slight outsider in every room, no matter how perfectly she dressed, no matter how correctly she behaved, no matter how elegantly she spoke French when the occasion called for it. The outsider feeling was subtle enough that most people never saw it. But Jackie felt it, and it shaped her. She became expert over those years at appearing to belong everywhere she went, while reserving the interior of herself for no one in particular. It was the beginning of a lifelong habit of controlled presentation, of showing the world at a surface so polished that the surface became the story. Underneath that surface, she was exceptional in ways that the social world she inhabited actively preferred to overlook. She read everything available to her before she started school. She studied ballet, wrote her own stories and drew illustrations for them, composed poetry before she was 10 years old. She absorbed French until it was functionally a first language, and went on to add Spanish and Italian over the following years. By age 11, she had won several national equestrian championships, riding with a precision and physical commitment that her instructors found remarkable in a child. The horse was the purest thing in her life, the only activity that required complete honesty from her. On horseback, there is no room for performance. There is only the communication between rider and animal, direct and unambiguous, and the satisfaction of doing the work correctly. She graduated from Miss Porter's boarding school in Farmington, Connecticut in June of 1947, and was celebrated as Debutante of the Year for the 1947-48 social season, a distinction that meant a great deal in certain circles, and which Jackie regarded with the same composed detachment she brought to most formal recognition. She was 17 years old, beautiful in an unconventional way that photographs captured imperfectly, possessed of 4 languages and an intellectual capacity that the world she was being presented to found faintly inconvenient. And already so thoroughly practiced in the art of revealing only what she chose to reveal, that most people who met her walked away feeling they had encountered something rare and warm, and somehow just beyond their grasp. She left boarding school having learned everything her formation had to teach her. She was about to encounter the world that would put all of it to use. By the time Jacqueline Bouvier arrived in Washington in the early 1950s, she was exactly the kind of woman the capital's political world noticed but could not quite place. She had studied at Vassar for 2 years, then transferred to the Sorbonne in Paris for a year abroad that she later described as the period when she felt most naturally and completely at home in herself. Paris gave her permission to be the person she actually was, intellectual and curious, and entirely uninterested in the social hierarchies that organized American upper-class life. She returned to complete her degree at George Washington University, graduating in 1951 with a qualification in French literature. She was 22 years old, fluent in 4 languages, and genuinely uncertain what to do with capabilities that the available social scripts for women of her background did not particularly know how to accommodate. She took a job at the Washington Times-Herald as an inquiring photographer, a title that sounds modest but that suited her more precisely than almost any role she would hold for the remainder of her life. The work was direct. She walked out into Washington, approached strangers, asked them pointed questions about their opinions and their daily lives, photographed them, and wrote their answers up as brief newspaper items. It required curiosity, an ability to put people at ease quickly, and an instinct for the revealing detail. Jackie had all three in abundance, and she applied them to the job with a genuine enthusiasm that surprised people who expected a girl of her background and beauty to be performing condescension. She was not performing anything. She was, in those months at the Times Herald, the most purely herself she would ever be in a professional setting, until the publishing years 3 decades later. It was in 1952, at a dinner party in Washington, organized by a mutual acquaintance named Charles Bartlett, that she met John F. Kennedy. He was a congressman from Massachusetts at the time, 12 years older than Jackie, Irish Catholic, possessed of a physical magnetism that photographs reproduced only partially, and already known in the specific circles that knew such things for his considerable and varied interest in women. Jackie would have recognized the type with absolute clarity. She had been watching her father be that type her entire life. The particular combination of intellectual brilliance and unreliable personal behavior, the charm that was genuine and also entirely available to anyone who happened to be in the room, the restlessness underneath the confidence, these were not new to her. They were familiar in the way that a landscape you have grown up in is familiar, not just recognizable, but formative. The courtship moved slowly and unevenly. Kennedy proposed in the spring of 1953 and then left on a summer sailing trip before the engagement had been publicly confirmed, leaving Jackie in the uncomfortable position of not knowing whether the proposal had been real or casual. He was not the kind of man who found uncertainty about his own intentions troubling. She was not the kind of woman who found it comfortable. The engagement was announced in June of 1953, and on September 12th of that year, 24-year-old Jacqueline Bouvier stood at the altar of St. Mary's Church in Newport, Rhode Island, and married Senator John F. Kennedy in front of 800 guests with a ceremony that the society pages called the Wedding of the Year. What she knew when she made that commitment is a question her biographers have approached from many angles and never fully resolved. The evidence accumulated across decades of memoirs, letters, and the accounts of people who knew her consistently points in one direction: clear eyes. She had read the pattern in her father's behavior long before she was old enough to name it. She had heard what Washington said about Kennedy and the circle she moved in. She was not a young woman walking naively toward a pleasant surprise. She was a woman whose entire formation had prepared her to love a man of exactly this kind, to accept the terms that came with such a man, and to manage the ongoing cost of that acceptance without allowing it to surface publicly. The calculation was real, and it was conscious, and it would prove more expensive than she had anticipated. She made it anyway, with both hands. Behind the wedding photographs, behind the society column coverage, and the image of the gilded young couple beginning their American life together, the marriage was already revealing its actual architecture. Kennedy's back surgeries in the mid-1950s left him in serious pain for extended stretches of time, and during those months Jackie remained beside him, reading to him, organizing his correspondence, and encouraging him to write the book about political courage that would eventually become Profiles in Courage and win the Pulitzer Prize for biography in 1957. Her contribution to that project was not ceremonial. She had been translating French-language material about Vietnam for Kennedy even during their engagement, producing an 84-page report on France's colonial history in Indochina that Kennedy used in his Senate work. She coached his public speaking with a consistency and intelligence that aides noticed but understood was not for public discussion. Ted Sorensen, one of Kennedy's closest advisors, later said that whatever political work Jackie did for her husband, they kept strictly between them. The arrangement suited both partners perfectly. He received an intellectual partnership whose depth the world would not be asked to credit. She received proximity to power at a scale that her own formidable capabilities might never have generated independently. The early years of the marriage carried grief alongside everything else. Jackie suffered a miscarriage in the first years. In 1956, she delivered a stillborn daughter, whom the family later named Arabella. When Arabella died, it was Robert Kennedy who stayed with Jackie at the hospital, not JFK, who was elsewhere. This was not an isolated instance of Bobby's particular loyalty to Jackie. It was the beginning of a pattern that would define her relationship with Robert Kennedy for the rest of his life. He was the Kennedy who showed up when she needed someone, reliably and without agenda, in ways that her own husband was constitutionally unable to replicate. The crisis that came closest to ending the marriage entirely arrived in 1956, when JFK began a relationship with Joan Lundberg, a 23-year-old flight attendant and single mother. When Jackie discovered the affair, she did not absorb it with the practiced composure of later years. She found a divorce attorney. She was prepared to leave. Then, when JFK's father, Joseph Kennedy, discovered that she was making actual preparations rather than performing distress, he intervened in the manner characteristic of a man who had spent decades managing the gap between the Kennedy family's public image and its private reality. He offered Jackie $100,000 upon the birth of her first child, if she agreed to remain in the marriage. Jackie accepted the offer. Caroline Bouvier Kennedy was born on November 27, 1957. The financial arrangement had purchased exactly what it was designed to purchase. The public image of the Kennedy marriage remained intact. The private reality continued underneath it, largely unaltered. John F. Kennedy Jr. arrived on November 25, 1960, 3 weeks before his father would be inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States. Jackie had spent the final months of the campaign contributing to it in ways that were never fully acknowledged publicly, writing a syndicated newspaper column called Campaign Wife, recording television spots in Spanish and Italian aimed at immigrant and ethnic voters, and translating campaign material with the same efficiency she had brought to everything else. The contributions were kept quiet at JFK's preference. He understood the image he was presenting to the country, and it was an image in which the wife stood slightly behind the candidate in every sense. She arrived at the White House in January of 1961, and within 48 hours had assessed it and begun planning its transformation. The mansion's rooms were furnished with pieces that carried almost no historical significance, cluttered with the accumulated mediocrity of administrations that had not considered the building as a museum of American history. Jackie understood immediately what the White House could be and what it currently was not, and she brought to the renovation project the same combination of genuine scholarly interest, social influence, and organizational precision she had applied to everything she had undertaken since boarding school. She established a fine arts committee to oversee the restoration and solicited donations and loans of period furniture and decorative objects from across the country. She created the position of White House curator, the first time the building had ever had one. She worked with Rachel Lambert Mellon on the redesign of the Rose Garden and the East Garden, transforming both into spaces that have required almost no alteration since. She published a White House guidebook whose sales funded the restoration directly, eliminating the need to ask Congress for additional appropriations. And in February of 1962, she led a televised tour of the restored rooms that drew an audience of 80 million Americans and won her an Emmy Award. The tour remains one of the most watched television programs in the history of the medium to that point. The diplomatic record was equally substantial and considerably less discussed. She visited India and Pakistan in 1962, France in 1961, and Greece in the fall of 1963, and in each country she conducted herself with the instinctive cultural fluency of a woman who genuinely understood that language is only the first layer of how nations recognize each other. When the Kennedy delegation arrived in France, the public response to Jackie was so overwhelming that President Kennedy introduced himself to President de Gaulle as the man who had accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris. He was not being entirely ironic. In 1963, she successfully negotiated the loan of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa for an American tour, an achievement accomplished almost entirely through her personal relationships with French cultural officials, and one that required more skill and patience than most official diplomatic missions of the same period. Presidential advisor Clark Clifford wrote to her during this time that once in a great while an individual captures the imagination of people all over the world, and that she had done this and had transformed it into a critical asset for the nation. He was right. She was the most effective diplomatic instrument the Kennedy administration possessed, and the administration used her accordingly while simultaneously maintaining the public fiction that her role was primarily ornamental. Underneath the public performance, the private life of the marriage continued on its familiar terms. Jackie knew about the White House secretaries known informally as Fiddle and Faddle, who accompanied JFK on foreign trips and whose precise role required no great imagination to understand. She pointed out one of them to a Paris-matched journalist in French and identified her as the girl who was sleeping with her husband. The remark was controlled, sardonic, and entirely off the record, which was the only way Jackie ever permitted herself to acknowledge these realities in the presence of others. She knew about Judith Campbell Exner, who maintained a 2-year relationship with JFK that overlapped with Exner's role as a conduit between the president and Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana. She knew about Mary Pinchot Meyer, the Washington socialite whose ongoing relationship with JFK during the presidency was perhaps the most emotionally substantive of all his White House involvements, and who was found shot dead in Georgetown in October of 1964, 1 year after the assassination, in a murder that was never solved. The one situation she could not treat with her customary detachment was Marilyn Monroe, and the distinction is revealing. Monroe was different from the others not because the relationship was more serious, but because Monroe was uncontrollable. Jackie later told people she had always singled Monroe out as a potential larger problem than the rest. In April of 1962, Monroe telephoned the Kennedy home in Hyannisport looking for Jack. Jackie answered the phone and recognized the voice before Monroe had finished her first sentence. 1 month later, Monroe performed Happy Birthday to the president at Madison Square Garden in a sequined dress that fit like a second skin, while Jackie was conspicuously absent from the event entirely. When Monroe died of an overdose in August of that year, Jackie said of her that she had been a disaster waiting to happen and someone too vulnerable to be played with by JFK. She was bereft by the death, she told friends, but she had seen it coming. Her main concern, she said, had always been JFK himself. She knew what it took to be with a very powerful man. And great men, she had concluded across 10 years of observation, carry great flaws alongside everything else. That response was not the answer of a woman who believed nothing was happening between her husband and Monroe. It was the response of a woman who had made a clear-eyed decision about what she was going to do with the information she possessed. The loss that finally fractured the polished surface of the marriage was not another woman at all. It was a child. On August 7, 1963, Jackie gave birth 5 weeks prematurely to a son. Patrick Bouvier Kennedy lived for 39 hours before dying of hyaline membrane disease. The grief was profound and immediate, and it changed something between Jackie and JFK in ways that 10 years of managed infidelity had not managed to touch. Arthur Schlesinger, who had direct access to both Kennedys during this period, wrote that the death of Patrick had paradoxically brought the couple closer than they had ever been, and that their marriage never seemed more solid than in those final months of 1963. The shared grief had done what the shared success and the shared political project had not. It had made them, briefly and genuinely, a unit rather than a performance. Jackie fell into a deep depression in the weeks after Patrick's death. Her friend Aristotle Onassis invited her to recuperate on his yacht in the Greek islands. JFK was reluctant to have his wife photographed aboard the yacht of a man with Onassis's complicated reputation, but he ultimately agreed because he believed the trip would help her recover. She returned to the United States on October 17, 1963, rested and steadied. She had not planned to go to Texas in November. She was not required to, but the marriage felt, for the first time in many years, like something genuinely present between them, something worth the effort of a political trip, and she agreed to go. Here is what the photographs did not show. Here is what the official record carefully omitted. Here is what Jackie Kennedy carried through every state dinner, every foreign trip, every televised appearance, and every smiling public moment across 10 years of marriage to the 35th President of the United States. She had known from the beginning, not in the shocked, disbelieving way of a woman encountering infidelity as a surprise, but in the specific, clear-eyed way of a woman who had been shown the template in childhood and had walked toward it voluntarily with full information because she had calculated that the other things on offer were worth the cost. She had watched her father be exactly the kind of man JFK was. She had identified the pattern before their first date was over. She had chosen to proceed anyway for reasons that were her own and that she never explained to anyone with complete candor. Gossip columnist Liz Smith, who was close to several of Jackie's intimate friends, reported that people including Truman Capote and Gore Vidal told her Jackie knew all about Judith Campbell Exner and everyone else, and that she had read the published accounts of Exner's relationship with JFK with what was described as high interest rather than shock. Jackie was reportedly unsurprised by Exner's memoir when it appeared in 1977. She had known. She had always known. The question that drove her private management of that knowledge was never whether JFK was faithful. It was how much any of it would cost her publicly if she failed to contain it. The Joe Kennedy payment is the detail that makes everything else in the marriage legible. She had been offered $100,000 by her father-in-law to stay in a marriage she had been preparing to leave. She had accepted the money. The transaction was private, known to very few people, and it reframes every subsequent act of Jackie's marriage management as the behavior not of a passive victim, but of a woman who had made a specific financial and social calculation and was honoring its terms. She had been paid, in effect, to protect the Kennedy family's public image. By the time JFK was assassinated, she had been doing that work for 7 years and had become extraordinarily skilled at it. The therapy she entered after Dallas illuminated the specific texture of what that work had cost her. She began seeing Dr. Marianne Criss, a psychoanalyst, in the years following the assassination. According to notes described to biographer J. Randy Taraborelli by the doctor's secretary, Jackie had said of JFK in one of their sessions, "He went out in a blaze of glory. The way he died had completely robbed her of the right to hate him. Her grief was not, as Dr. Criss wrote in the margin of one entry, tidy. That single word, tidy, is the most precise word in the entire record of Jackie Kennedy's private life. She had every reason, accumulated across a decade, to feel complicated and contradictory things about the man the world required her to mourn as a hero and a martyr. His death had made simplicity mandatory. She was required to perform heroic grief publicly, and she performed it with complete technical perfection, while the actual grief, the untidy one, the one that included everything she had a right to feel, was hers alone to manage in a therapist's office. The discovery, during that same therapy, that Dr. Criss had previously treated Marilyn Monroe added another layer of complication that could not be resolved cleanly. The same woman Jackie had identified as potentially the most dangerous of JFK's involvements was connected to her own private refuge. The woman she had managed most carefully from a distance had shared a therapist with her. There was nowhere in Jackie's life that this particular set of circumstances could not find her, and that finding continued even in spaces she had set aside for her own privacy. She had spent 10 years learning to hold two realities at once without flinching publicly at either of them. She did not know, on the morning of November 22, 1963, that the day ahead would demand everything she had ever learned and still not be sufficient to make what was coming bearable. November 22, 1963, Dallas, Texas. The presidential motorcade moved through the city in warm sunshine, through cheering crowds lining the streets of Dealey Plaza. Jackie had been given red roses that morning at Love Field, and she had registered the detail as unusual. She later told journalist Theodore White that every other Texas city had presented her with yellow roses, the state flower. Dallas had given her red ones. She had thought it strange. She was right to think so. The shots came at 12:30 in the afternoon, a crack of sound, and then another, and the world divided permanently into the part that existed before and the part that existed after. Jackie later described the moment to her therapist with a precision that suggests the image never fully left her. She saw a clean piece detaching from her husband's head with complete clarity. Then he slumped into her lap. His blood and the matter of his brain were on her pink Chanel suit, on her hands, on the red roses in her arms. She held him as the car accelerated through the streets toward Parkland Memorial Hospital. She called his name repeatedly. She told him she loved him. The doctors at Parkland told her he was gone before she had stopped hoping they were wrong. She refused to leave the hospital without his body. She refused the sedation that aides pressed on her. When officials attempted to separate her from her husband's body for procedural reasons, she resisted until they stopped trying. She was 34 years old, widowed within seconds, and making decisions in the hours that followed, with a clarity and purposefulness that everyone who witnessed it later described as extraordinary and faintly impossible to account for. People who are destroyed by grief do not function this way. Jackie Kennedy was destroyed by grief and functioned with absolute precision anyway, because something in her formation had produced a woman who could hold catastrophe in one hand and self-possession in the other simultaneously, and not drop either. She refused to change the dress. When officials and aides on Air Force One suggested she put on something clean before Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president, she declined. She said she wanted them to see what they had done. This was not shock-producing paralysis. This was not an inability to process what had happened. This was a deliberate political act, executed by a woman who understood, even in the worst hour of her life, that the image would outlast the moment, and she intended to have a hand in what it communicated. Every photograph taken during that swearing-in ceremony shows the same thing. A woman in profound and genuine grief, performing absolute composure, one hand holding the new president's hand, her pink suit still stained, her eyes still clear because something in her had calculated, correctly, that the photographs would be permanent, and she was going to be in control of what they showed. On the flight back to Washington, she sat beside her husband's casket and did not sleep. She was already thinking forward about the funeral, which she would plan in meticulous detail, modeling it on Abraham Lincoln's state funeral almost a century before, ensuring that the grandeur of the ceremony matched the significance of the loss in ways that would anchor the historical memory of the Kennedy presidency. About her children, 3 days and 5 days from their respective birthdays. About the story that was going to be told about this man and this administration, and about who was going to be allowed to tell it. She buried her husband on November 25, 1963. 6 days later, she had a plan. On the night of November 29, 1963, in driving November rain, Jackie Kennedy summoned journalist Theodore White to the Kennedy family compound in Hyannisport and received him at 8:30 in the evening. She had chosen White with the same care she applied to every important decision. He had written The Making of the President, 1960, the most influential account of JFK's election campaign, a book that had portrayed Kennedy in an emphatically favorable light and had helped construct the public image of the administration before it had even begun. He was a Pulitzer Prize winner with credibility among the reading public. He was a friend of the family, which meant he was susceptible to the particular kind of moral pressure that a grieving widow with a clear agenda could apply without it ever appearing to be pressure at all. He was the right tool for the job she needed done. White later described Jackie as absolutely composed when he arrived. The house was quiet. The grief was real. And underneath the grief was a woman with a purpose so clear and a mind so organized that White, who had spent his career interviewing the most powerful people in American politics, found himself doing exactly what she required him to do before he had fully understood how it had happened. She spoke for 4 hours. She told him about Dallas, about the heat and the crowds and the red roses and the sounds she had heard and the things she had seen in that car. She told him that she kept returning in the days since to a line from the Broadway musical Camelot, a production she said JFK had loved, and that they had listened to together at the end of evenings in the White House. She quoted the lyric about one brief shining moment and told White that this was what the Kennedy years had been. She said there would be great presidents again, but there would never be another Camelot. She said this was what she wanted the world to understand and remember. She knew exactly what she was doing. The political columnists had spent the week writing their assessments of the Kennedy administration, and the assessments were mixed in ways that Jackie found intolerable. There had been genuine achievements and genuine failures, and there had been the affairs, which were beginning to surface in the kind of private Washington conversations that eventually become public Washington conversations. And if the historical record was allowed to form on its own terms, the portrait that emerged would be complicated and contradictory and human-scaled. Jackie was not going to permit a human-scaled portrait. She was going to give the country a myth, and she was going to deliver it through a trusted journalist in an exclusive interview while the public was still too stunned and too sorrowful to examine its foundations critically. White withdrew to the servants' quarters of the compound to draft his piece and telephone it through to his Life magazine editors, who were holding their presses at considerable expense on a Saturday night. When the editors pushed back on the Camelot imagery, arguing it was too sentimental for the occasion, White paused. Jackie was nearby. She read the tone of the exchange without hearing the editor's side of it and signaled clearly to White that the Camelot references were not negotiable. The editors relented. The article appeared in the December 6, 1963 issue of Life magazine, and the Camelot myth entered the permanent record of American history with the full force of a widow's authority and a nation's unexamined grief behind it. Theodore White donated his notes from that conversation to the Kennedy Library in 1969, with specific instructions that they remain sealed until 1 year after Jackie's death. They were made public in May of 1995. They revealed a woman who had used the word obsessed to describe her own determination to ensure her husband was remembered as a hero. White later wrote that he regretted the role he had played in transmitting what he came to regard as a myth. He had been used, he felt. He had also been entirely willing, which he also felt, and the combination of those two facts was something he spent years trying to reconcile. Jackie had always known how to make people willing participants in her projects. It was one of the most consistent things about her. She had protected the legacy. Now she had to survive being the monument to it. After the funeral, after the Camelot interview, after the eternal flame was lit above the grave at Arlington Cemetery, Jacqueline Kennedy moved with her children to a 15-room apartment at 1040 Fifth Avenue in New York City and discovered that the world had absolutely no intention of allowing her to mourn in private. Paparazzi followed her to the park, to the theater, to the dry cleaner, to school drop-off, into restaurants where other diners pretended not to stare and then stared anyway. She would eventually obtain a restraining order against one particularly aggressive photographer who made her daily movements a form of legal stalking. Bishop Philip Hannon, who had given the Mass at JFK's funeral and remained a friend, wrote decades later that Jackie had confided her deepest frustration to him. The world, she told him, viewed her not as a woman, but as a symbol of its own pain. She was 34 years old, and she was required to be America's grief in human form, available to the public, indefinitely, on demand. The Kennedy family had their own requirements, which aligned with this demand and made it worse. They needed Jackie visible and accessible and in service of the Kennedy political project. Bobby was running for senator from New York in 1964 and needed her endorsement. There were political appearances expected, campaign events at which her presence was considered an asset the family was entitled to deploy. She was weary of it. She had been placing herself in service of the Kennedy image since 1956. She had paid for that service with her privacy and her silence and $100,000 worth of personal compromise. She had given enough, and she knew it, and she found no way to say so that the family would accept. Robert Kennedy was the exception to everything. As he had always been, he was the Kennedy who had stayed with her during Arabella's stillbirth. He was the Kennedy who had been a genuine surrogate father to Caroline and John Jr. after the assassination, showing up consistently in ways that his brother had never been temperamentally capable of. He had helped Jackie manage the transition out of the White House and into private life with a steadiness that came from caring about her specifically, rather than caring about what she represented. She relied on him in ways she had never relied on JFK, and the reliance was based on something real. Bobby was loyal to Jackie herself, not to the image of her or the political utility of her. He was, in the way she would have understood and used the phrase, the genuine article. On June 6, 1968, Bobby Kennedy was shot at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles in the minutes after he had won the California Democratic primary. He died the following morning from his wounds. For Jackie, this was not another public tragedy to be processed and managed. It was the destruction of the one structure of human support that had sustained her inside American public life since the day JFK died. She told friends in the days that followed, "If they are killing Kennedys, my children are targets. I want to get out of this country." The man she chose to marry was not the man she loved. Biographer Barbara Leeming, who had access to Jackie's private correspondence with British diplomat David Ormsby Gore, the man who had proposed to Jackie and been declined in favor of Onassis, reported that Jackie was entirely clear on this point. It was not a marriage of love. Ormsby Gore had been one of JFK's closest friends and had been close to Jackie throughout the years after Dallas, and Jackie had written to him from Onassis's yacht in Greece, explaining her decision. She chose Onassis. She chose the man who possessed a private island, a private security force of 75 armed men, a personal airline, and the financial means to extract her and her children from a country in which she could not feel safe. The American public's reaction to the announcement was immediate and unforgiving. One newspaper headline read, "Jackie marries blank check." Onassis's own children, Alexander and Christina, referred to her from the first moment they heard the news as the gold digger. The Kennedy family was deeply unhappy. The Catholic Church raised brief concerns about whether the marriage would result in excommunication, concerns that Cardinal Cushing of Boston dismissed publicly as nonsense. None of it slowed Jackie for a moment. She had survived far more significant opposition than public disapproval. On October 20th, 1968, 39-year-old Jacqueline Kennedy stood in a small chapel on the island of Scorpios, wearing an ivory Valentino gown, while Caroline and John Jr. held 6-foot candles in the ancient Greek Orthodox ceremony. Onassis's children watched from a corner of the chapel with expressions that communicated exactly what they thought of the arrangement. The Ionian Sea glittered outside the chapel windows. The world called it a betrayal. Jackie called it survival. She was right on her own terms, and she knew it. The marriage lasted 6.5 years. For the majority of those 6.5 years, Jackie and Aristotle Onassis lived on opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean, a geographical arrangement that suited the actual nature of their partnership better than any shared residence could have. Jackie spent the school terms in New York with Caroline and John Jr. Onassis was in Europe managing his shipping empire, his airline, his casino interests in Monaco, and his long-standing emotional entanglement with Maria Callas, which the marriage to Jackie had not resolved, and which Jackie understood from the beginning would not resolve. She knew. Onassis's personal secretary Kiki Moutsatsos later told interviewers that Jackie was not happy about her husband's ongoing devotion to Callas, but never raised her voice, never confronted him directly, never made scenes. She pretended nothing was happening, Moutsatsos said. She was very smart. Jackie had been practicing precisely this management technique since she was 10 years old, and her father moved out of the family home. It had become as natural to her as breathing. When Onassis came to New York, he stayed at his suite at the Pierre Hotel rather than at her Fifth Avenue apartment. They shared 6 residences among them, including the apartment in New York, a horse farm in New Jersey, his apartment on Avenue Foch in Paris, his house in Athens, the island of Scorpios, and the yacht Christina. But they occupied those properties rarely and simultaneously, almost never during the regular months of the year. They had very little in common beyond a mutual appreciation for expensive living and an understanding of the transaction they had each entered. Onassis gave Jackie a monthly allowance of $30,000, which she supplemented through a habit that her friends found simultaneously practical and revealing. She bought couture, wore each piece once or twice, and sold it to a consignment shop, pocketing the proceeds above the allowance. She had rooms full of unopened purchases at the Fifth Avenue apartment. The spending had nothing to do with the objects, and everything to do with the assertion of autonomy within a constrained situation. When Alexander Onassis died in January of 1973 after a plane crash, the marriage lost what little functional warmth it still possessed. Christina Onassis, who had called Jackie the gold digger from the beginning, told her father in his grief that the Kennedy curse had followed Jackie into the Onassis family and that before long she would kill them all. Onassis, shattered by the loss of his son, did not fully reject the accusation. He turned inward and away from Jackie in ways that made the existing distance between them absolute. The household became, in the final 2 years of the marriage, something Jackie endured rather than inhabited. Onassis died on March 15, 1975, in a French hospital with Christina beside him and Jackie in New York. Jackie issued a statement that described him as a man who had rescued her at a moment when her life was engulfed with shadows, and said she would be eternally grateful. The statement was gracious and precisely measured and entirely sincere as far as it extended. It did not extend very far. Christina settled with Jackie for $25 million in exchange for Jackie not contesting Onassis's will. The estate also delivered $26 million to Jackie directly. She was 45 years old, twice widowed, and for the first time in her adult life possessed of financial independence that carried no conditions and no strings and belonged to no one's project but her own. In the summer of 1975, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis walked into the offices of Viking Press in New York City, and began work as a consulting editor at a salary of $200 per week. She had a small office. She answered her own phone. She walked to the lobby herself to collect her guests rather than sending an assistant. She waited in line to use the copier alongside the junior editorial staff. She made coffee for the authors who came to see her, a gesture that produced, in at least one documented case, a paralysis of social uncertainty in the recipient that she found quietly amusing. She was one of the most recognizable human beings on earth, and she was asking people if they wanted coffee in a small office with no windows. She left Viking in 1977 when the company published a novel that depicted an assassination plot against a character modeled on Senator Edward Kennedy. She departed on principle and without drama, the way she did most things, and joined Doubleday the following year at a starting salary of $20,000 per year. Over the following 16 years at Doubleday, she rose to a salary of $100,000 annually, edited more than 100 books across every genre and subject that interested her, and built a professional reputation entirely separate from every name she had ever carried. Her editorial list was as varied and individual as the woman who assembled it. She acquired Michael Jackson's memoir Moonwalk after a negotiation that included, among its complications, Jackson's insistence that she write a personal foreword for the book. She resisted this demand for weeks on the grounds that she did not attach her name to the books she edited, then ultimately relented when Jackson indicated he would withdraw the project entirely if she refused. She produced the foreword. The book sold millions of copies. She was the editor who championed the companion volume to Bill Moyers's Power of Myth series, a project that originated in Jackie's personal interest in the mythologist Joseph Campbell's work and resulted in a book that has remained continuously in print for decades. She worked with Diana Vreeland, George Plimpton, and Nobel Prize laureate Naguib Mahfouz. She arrived at editorial meetings with projects that her colleagues found both unexpected and impeccably argued. She was, by consistent account of everyone who worked alongside her at Doubleday, more genuinely humble and more genuinely hardworking than any of them had expected, and considerably more fun. Her close friends reported unanimously that these were the happiest years of her life, not the White House, not the Camelot years that the world had decided were her defining period, not the golden afternoons on Scorpios. The happiest years were in a small office in Midtown Manhattan, reading manuscripts and making cases for books she believed in, doing work that was entirely her own, in a life she had arranged according to no one's requirements but her own. Maurice Templesman had been a peripheral presence in Jackie's life since the Kennedy White House years, one of the many business contacts and friends of the administration who had moved through that world and remained in the adjacent circles afterward. He was a Belgian-American diamond merchant born in Antwerp in 1929 to an Orthodox Jewish family that had emigrated to New York in 1940 to escape Nazi persecution. He had entered the diamond business at 16, working alongside his father, and had built over the following decades a trading network of remarkable reach and influence, developing relationships with African heads of state that gave him unusual access to the continent's mineral wealth and made him a figure of genuine consequence in the intersection of commerce and diplomacy that characterized the diamond trade during the Cold War. He was not a physically imposing man. He was short and balding and disliked ostentation in every form. He was also discreet to a degree that Jackie, who had spent her adult life in close proximity to people who were constitutionally incapable of discretion, found almost impossibly attractive. He was already immensely wealthy, which meant he had nothing to gain from her money and nothing to prove through association with her name. And he was, according to everyone who observed the relationship closely, genuinely devoted to Jackie as a person, to her actual preferences and her actual needs and her actual comfort, in ways that neither of her husbands had managed with any consistency. After 1975, as Jackie settled into New York and the publishing career and the life she was finally building entirely on her own terms, Templesman's friendship with her deepened into something else. By approximately 1988, he was living at her Fifth Avenue apartment, though he remained legally married to his wife Lily, whose devout Jewish faith made divorce a complicated proposition. He managed the $26 million Onassis inheritance with sufficient skill that Jackie's estate was worth approximately $45 million at the time of her death. He accompanied her to dinners on the Upper East Side, and weekends at her horse farm in New Jersey and summers sailing at her Martha's Vineyard estate. He took walks with her in Central Park. A friend of Jackie's captured the distinction between Templesman and everything that had come before him with a single, precise observation. Onassis had considered Jackie another jewel in his crown. Maurice knew better. He protected her and respected her privacy. That was the whole summary of what had been missing from every relationship she had been in before, and that was what she had finally found. But before the story reaches its end, something must be named that the photographs never recorded, and the biographies have approached only sideways, and the Camelot myth was designed from the beginning to obscure. Something the burned letters were intended to prevent from surviving her. The secret Jackie Kennedy took to her grave was not a single hidden fact. It was a pattern of knowledge sustained across an entire lifetime, managed with a consistency that never broke in public, and protected with a determination that extended all the way to the fireplace. She had known about her father before she was 10 years old. She had known about JFK's character before she agreed to marry him. She had accepted Joe Kennedy's money to remain in a marriage she had been prepared to leave. She had managed the ongoing knowledge of her husband's involvements with a calculated composure that looked from the outside like dignity and was, from the inside, the most demanding and exhausting labor of her life. She had built the Camelot myth not only to protect a dead man's legacy, but to protect the value of her own investment in that legacy, an investment she had been making since 1956 with the currency of her silence and her endurance and her total public self-possession. And she had stayed through the years with Onassis in the same adaptive posture she had occupied since childhood. We'll show watching another powerful man continue his emotional entanglement with another woman and choosing again to see nothing. The therapy notes captured the specific weight of what this had cost her. She had said of JFK that he went out in a blaze of glory and that the manner of his death had completely robbed her of the right to hate him. Her therapist had noted in the margin of that session that the grief was not tidy. That description, not tidy, stands as the most honest phrase in the entire record of Jackie Kennedy's inner life. She had every right to feel complicated, contradictory, and even angry things about the man the world was requiring her to enshrine as a martyr and a hero. His death had made simplicity not just preferable, but mandatory. She was required to grieve in a way that served the national narrative. The actual grief, the one that included everything she had a right to feel over 10 years of managed compromise, was hers to carry in private. The Camelot interview, revisited from this angle, looks different than it does in the standard account of a bereft widow protecting her husband's memory. It was all of that. It was also the final installment of a payment Jackie had been making since the year Joe Kennedy had placed $100,000 in her account. She had paid for the Kennedy presidency with her privacy and her knowledge and her refusal to allow any of it to surface publicly. When JFK was killed, she was not going to allow the record to be written by people who had contributed nothing to the cost. The myth was the return on a decade of investment. She intended to collect it. She had kept her secrets for 64 years, and as the spring of 1994 arrived and the doctors gave her information she had been preparing herself to receive, she made one final decision. The secrets were not going to outlive her. Whatever remained of the gap between the performance and the truth, she was going to close it herself, with fire, before anyone else could measure it. Every night that week, she invited someone to come. Jack Warnecke, the architect who had designed the memorial gravesite for JFK at Arlington National Cemetery, and who had been Jackie's lover in the years after the assassination, was among those summoned in the final weeks of her life. He arrived at her Fifth Avenue apartment to find her seated by the fireplace in silk pajamas and a chenille sweater, a stack of correspondence in her lap, neatly tied with yarn. She explained the ritual. Every night that week she had invited a trusted friend or family member to come and participate in it. She untied the yarn. She took a letter from the stack. She read it, the full letter, in silence. Then she placed it in the fire. Letters from her children, letters from JFK, letters from Aristotle Onassis, letters from her father, John Bouvier III, Black Jack. the man who had taught her everything she had ever needed to know about the category of men she had spent her life choosing and managing. Letters from Warnecke himself. She read each one before she burned it. She said nothing about the contents of any of them. The fire took them, and the record shortened, deliberately and permanently. This was not a woman in panic. This was not desperation producing recklessness. This was completion. Jackie Kennedy had spent 64 years as a woman whose interior was sealed from the public gaze, and she was not going to allow her death to open what her life had kept closed. The letters were the last remaining evidence of the gap between the surface she had always shown and the person she had always been, and she was eliminating that evidence with the same composure she had brought to every other management task of her adult life. The cancer had been discovered the previous November when a fall from a horse during a fox hunt in Middleburg. Virginia led doctors to examine a swollen lymph node in her groin. They had diagnosed it initially as an infection and sent her home with antibiotics. By December, she had developed additional symptoms: swollen lymph nodes in her neck, pain in her abdomen, a persistent cough that appeared during a Caribbean vacation over the Christmas holidays. She flew back to New York and underwent further testing. The diagnosis was non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. She began chemotherapy in January of 1994. She publicly announced the diagnosis in February, saying the initial prognosis was good. She continued working at Doubleday. She lost her hair and wore a wig. She walked in Central Park with Templesman on the days she had the strength for it. She believed for a time she had beaten it. After 4 rounds of chemotherapy, the tests came back clean, and she told Warnecke by telephone that she thought she had won. Then an MRI showed the cancer had spread to the membranes surrounding her brain and spinal cord. Then it reached her liver. When the doctors told her in mid-May that the disease was no longer treatable, she invoked the living will she had signed months earlier and went home. She returned to her apartment on May 18, 1994. Caroline was there. John Jr. was there. Morris Templesman was there, as he had been at her side through every stage of the illness, through every treatment and every scan and every revision of what the doctors believed was possible. Singer Carly Simon, a close friend from her New York years, was among the small group invited to say goodbye in those final days. Simon later described standing at Jackie's bedside holding her hand while John stood at the foot of the bed with his hands folded in prayer, and Morris stood beside him doing the same, while Gregorian chants played on the record player in the background. The room, Simon said, was peaceful in a way she had not expected. Jackie was at home, among her books, surrounded by people who had known her, specifically and personally, rather than known the idea of her. At 10:15 in the evening on May 19, 1994, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis died in her own bedroom in her own apartment in New York City. She was 64 years old. May 19th was her father's birthday. John Vernon Bouvier III, Black Jack, the man whose particular combination of charm and faithlessness had set the template for every significant relationship of her adult life, had been born on that date. She had spent 64 years learning what his example had taught her, and using it, and paying the cost of using it, and protecting the version of events she needed the world to hold. She died on the day he had entered the world. Whether that was a coincidence of the calendar or the one variable in her meticulous final arrangement that she had chosen not to resist, no one will ever know. Knowing Jackie, both possibilities seem entirely consistent with who she was. John F. Kennedy Jr. descended from the apartment the following morning and stood on the sidewalk outside the building in front of hundreds of cameras and reporters and delivered a statement of 8 sentences. She was surrounded by her friends and her family and her books and the people and the things that she loved. And she did it in her own way, and we all feel lucky for that. And now she is in God's hands. It was the most precise description of her death that language could supply. She had arranged it. Of course she had arranged it. The funeral was held on May 23, 1994, at St. Ignatius Loyola Roman Catholic Church on Park Avenue, the same church where Jackie had been baptized as an infant and confirmed as a young woman, and where she had attended services regularly throughout her New York years. Templesman stood in a place of honor alongside the family and read the C.P. Cavafy poem, Ithaca. No member of the Onassis family attended. President Clinton delivered the eulogy at Arlington National Cemetery, where Jackie was buried next to JFK and the two children, Arabella and Patrick, who had not survived their births. She had arranged to be placed in the same model of casket that had been used for JFK. She was finally and permanently beside him. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was featured 27 times on the Gallup list of the most admired people of the second half of the 20th century, a number surpassed only by Billy Graham and Queen Elizabeth II, and higher than that recorded by any American president. She won an Emmy Award. She preserved Grand Central Terminal from demolition through her work with the Municipal Art Society and her willingness to use her public profile in service of a cause she believed in. She negotiated the Mona Lisa's American tour. She edited more than 100 books across a 19-year publishing career, including works that remain in continuous print decades after her death. She spoke 4 languages. She invented, in a 4-hour conversation held in a servant's room in a driving November rain, the myth that shaped how America has understood the Kennedy presidency for more than 60 years. The estate she left was worth approximately $45 million, grown by Templesman from the $26 million the Onassis estate had delivered. She left the bulk of it to her children. Her daughter Caroline went on to serve as United States ambassador to Japan and later to Australia, carrying forward a public legacy that Jackie had protected and shaped for decades. Her son, John F. Kennedy, Jr., died on July 16, 1999, when the small plane he was piloting went down in the Atlantic Ocean near Martha's Vineyard. He was 38 years old. His ashes were scattered at sea. Jackie did not live to see it, which may have been the one mercy the calendar offered. The letters she burned are gone. The therapy records remain sealed. The private correspondence that might have illuminated the distance between the public record and the truth she actually inhabited no longer exists. That gap has itself become a kind of legacy, the legacy of a woman who understood that controlling information is controlling history, and who exercised that control with more sustained discipline and more consistent precision than almost any figure the 20th century produced. What the world wanted from Jackie Kennedy was poise under circumstances that would have destroyed most people. She gave them that fully and for decades. What it wanted was loyalty to an image of American greatness and a willingness to embody that image at personal cost. She gave them that too for longer than anyone had a right to ask. What it never thought to demand was the truth of what those gifts had cost her, because the world had decided she was a symbol, and symbols do not have interior lives, and the distance between what a symbol projects and what the person inside it actually carries is not considered a public concern. Jackie knew the distance. She had been living inside it since the morning she was 10 years old, and her father moved out of the family apartment, and her mother began reconstructing the surface of their lives for the benefit of everyone who was watching. She had spent the next 5.5 decades managing that distance with such consistent artistry that the world never fully closed it. Not the biographers, not the grief, not the decades of photographs, not the years of speculation, not the fires. She said, "I want to live my life, not record it." She burned the record. She arranged her own death with the same control she had brought to every previous performance. And she left the world with the image and the myth and the unanswerable question of what the woman behind all of it had actually known and actually felt and actually thought about all of it, which was in the end precisely what she had always intended. If you found her story as powerful as we did, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another one.